Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. I'm your host, Taqib Musa, and I'm joined today to speak on the topic of Quranic exegesis and tafsir with one of the foremost authorities in the English language on Quranic exegesis and hermeneutics, Sheikh Sohaib Saeed and Sheikh Dr. Sohaib Saeed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just a little bit of an intro for our listeners. Sheikh Sohaib graduated with a BA and an MSc in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh. He then completed a PhD from SOAS on intra-Quranic hermeneutics, which he has told me means Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that. He's based out of Glasgow, and he's involved in various efforts, including being a chaplain, including lecturing Islamic studies, teaching Arabic, and various other efforts. So really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. Jazakallah khair. So we're going to talk about many topics, but primarily we're going to try and get an introduction on Quranic history, on tafsir, on exegesis. We started off with that word hermeneutics, and we try to not leave our listeners with something that they don't that is new potentially for them. So could you start us off with with a definition of what hermeneutics is?
Sure, of course. So of course the Quran is a communication. For Muslims, it is a basic point of belief that the Quran is a communication from divine revelation, that God is speaking, and then we encounter that speech in the form now of a book which we read. And when we read or when we listen to the Quran, we attempt to understand it and we process its meanings so that we can do something with those meanings, which is to change something in our lives, which is to follow its instructions, its commandments, its prohibitions. So understanding has been described in the Islamic sciences, in the Arabic language, as tafsir. And then under that tafsir, there is something called usul al-tafsir, or the principles of tafsir. So tafsir ultimately is understanding, but also explaining and clarifying what the revelation is saying. So there are going to be different levels of clarity. Some statements in the Quran are extremely clear and anyone could understand them, but we'd say anyone who at least understands the language would be able to understand them clearly and get the basic meaning. But there are some statements in the Quran which require a bit more expertise, a bit more familiarity, broader learning, deeper learning. So there you have the scholarly class or scholarly group of people who are called mufassirun. They are people who do tafsir, who clarify the meanings for other people. And then as for the methods that underpin that, those are what are called usul al-tafsir. So exegesis is a word that is perhaps the best one to use for tafsir in the English language. And hermeneutics corresponds closely to what we just called usul al-tafsir, or the principles and methods and processes underpinning it. However, hermeneutics in the Western sciences corresponds, to a sort of broader category than what we usually mean by usul al-tafsir, because hermeneutics started off as being something that was used for interpreting the Bible, and then it's moved on a great deal over the past few centuries to become something about understanding in general. How do we understand things? How do we interpret things? How do we process meanings? And that can apply to anything. So how as human beings do we encounter texts, and how do we understand them? So in a way, our understanding of usul al-tafsir could perhaps be broader than what it is. But usually when we say usul al-tafsir, we really are talking about the Quran and how we interpret the Quran.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. So that's quite and I think we've gone into some of the details. So hermeneutics is usul al-tafsir, the principles underpinning it, broadly speaking, and then we've got exegesis or tafsir. Now, it sounds well, a lot of these terms are, I guess, broad translations because it's not an exact replication of what it is. When we talk about Quranic exegesis, where do we draw the line? What is and what falls under the category of Quranic tafsir, and what isn't, and what becomes other terms or translations or things like that? Where do you draw the line between what is the kind of the circle that is inside of tafsir or exegesis?
I mean, when trying to assess disciplines and determine scholarly boundaries, where you draw the line can be a matter of taste and of different opinions. Basically speaking, we engage with the Qur'an in different ways for different purposes. And one of those purposes and one of those things that we do, or that some people need to do, is to draw out its meanings, clarify its meanings. And that can be as well on different levels. So we have some meanings which are more on the surface level, and you have things that you have to really think hard and dig deep to get to, right? So the surface level is the kind of thing that we could all easily encounter in translations of the Quran, right? Because translations will give you at least an understanding of what the words, the individual words and the structures mean. And sometimes they go a little bit further than that, especially in the footnotes, to give a little bit of contextualization. How do I understand this ayah in terms of what was it revealed for? Who was it revealed about? What are some other passages within the Quran or some relevant hadiths which would shed light on what this ayah actually means, because its apparent meaning might be something different from what is intended by it. So that is a level of tafsir which you can find in the Arabic language. So from the Arabic of the Quran to Arabic explanations, which are very simple, that is a kind of tafsir. And it corresponds, as I said, to translations in whatever language. So we shouldn't really be confused about the fact that translation is a form of tafsir, right? So either a translator is someone who is able to do tafsir on that level, or they are someone who's depending on the tafsir that exists in the Arabic language, and that's informing what they're writing in English or whatever language. So tafsir is all the information that would surround the meaning of the ayah, right? So that can encompass, as I said, a few things already: the background and context in which ayat were revealed, and the meaning of the Arabic expressions is core to that. And also it can extend to what is derived from the ayah. So what are the rulings that are delivered by the ayah? What are the implications of the ayah? What are the lessons of the ayah? These can also be part of tafsir. So I tend to think of it in three levels, which I describe as the textual analysis, right? So that's the kind of thing that you're going to come across definitely in translations. Then there's what I call pretext, which is the things in which that text has to be located, contextualized, right? So you can call it context as well. And that is both the revelatory context, which is a historical aspect, and the page context or the structural context. So when you read any ayah, you do need to read around it. You need to know what was said just before, especially. And sometimes you need to see what was said after in order to understand what exactly is intended by this particular verse. So that's what we call pretext, just because in a sense it comes before, it is prior to the text itself. And then post-text analysis is everything that is derived from the ayah. All of this can be called tafsir. And in the books which are in the genre of tafsir, you can find all of these things in different measures. And sometimes you find additional things, like explorations and tangential philosophical explorations, for example, in the Tafsir of Al-Razi. And you have this famous quip about the Tafsir of Al-Razi, which is one that I work closely with. But it was said by some scholars a little bit unkindly that it contains everything except tafsir, right? And others have retorted and said, no, it contains everything along with tafsir. But this comes down to the question that you asked, what is the boundary of what is tafsir and what's not tafsir, right? So you can have a broader kind of approach to that and say anything which pertains one way or another to understanding the meaning of the ayah, we'll call it tafsir. Or you could be much narrower and say it has to directly clarify something that was somehow obscure in the ayah in order to be tafsir. Otherwise, we'd call it something else. We'd call it supplementary materials to tafsir. But in terms of our tafsir literature, it encompasses a wide range of things which pertain to the meanings.
Okay, so we have, well, again, we've talked about kind of the definition is a bit unclear, and I think you touched upon some of the different types of tafsir. Are there any categorizations of tafsir or styles of doing tafsir that have been talked about?
Yes, of course. So first of all, we should go back a little bit in time, and this is a history podcast. So if we think about the earliest people who were doing tafsir, right? So first and foremost, it is the Prophet himself, peace be upon him. And we should recognize that the Prophet ﷺ did not directly explain most of the Qur'an. Most of the Qur'an, we do not have narrations from him where he would explain verbally the meanings of the Qur'an. But he explained the Qur'an by living it, by being, as has been said, the walking Qur'an. His sunnah is an explanation of the Qur'an as a whole. But in terms of what we are terming tafsir, where you look at a particular ayah and say, how do I understand this ayah? We do not have the material in the hadiths for most of the Qur'an. And the reason for that is not that it's all been lost, but we should understand that it's because the Prophet ﷺ did not go about explaining it in that way. And the reasons for that could be a few things. One of them is that the need was not felt immediately by those around him. So when there was a need, and we do have examples of it, so some companions came and asked him about something, or they were confused about something and needed to be corrected, then a moment of tafsir took place where the Prophet ﷺ would clarify. And if we were fortunate enough that someone went on to narrate that and then it came into the books of Hadith, then we can read about it now. But that is important to conceptualize tafsir as being something which is done according to need, right? When the need is not there, one simply hears the ayah and takes it. You know, God has spoken. I don't need to say something further unless, for example, if you don't speak Arabic, then I need to translate it for you. If something was somehow missing in your understanding of the ayah, then we keep adding and we keep providing what is needed. So the earliest tafsir that we have now is somewhat fragmented. We look at the statements of the companions, we can look at the statements then of the generation after them, the tabi'een, and what we have are these little snippets which come across as though what was happening is somebody would come and ask a question, or a point of contention arose and some clarification was needed from the more expert people who had witnessed revelation, who had been around at the time, who were best placed to speak authoritatively on what the Qur'an means. But even then, of course, the Sahaba often have different opinions about the meaning of a particular word, or even the context of the revelation of an ayah. You can find different statements from them. But what we don't have direct access to is, you know, to really understand how they understood the whole Qur'an in a sort of holistic way, in a cohesive way. You know, sometimes people make the mistake, I think, of thinking that a holistic view or coherence view of the Qur'an is something that is wholly and purely a modern phenomenon, whereas in the past they used to do things fragmentedly. No, you're just reading them that way because that's how things come to be in books, right? So if I'm looking at Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, for example, and I'm picking up a narration here, narration there, it doesn't mean he went around speaking in small narrations or that he himself saw the Quran that way. But tafsir in the beginning was generally according to need, and there are many things that we should be sure were left unsaid, were left unstated because nobody needed to say it out loud, or somebody said it out loud and it didn't get, eventually gathered in a book. Now, for those Sahaba, they would have said things according to the best of their knowledge, and on some occasions, we can be fairly sure that they must have been saying something that they heard from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Because if they're talking about some point about what's happening on the Day of Judgment, they would not have just guessed something like that. So this is what is called marfu' hukman, where you basically assume that in terms of its meaning, it must go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But a great deal of what they say is not like that. It is based on their knowledge and judgment, and therefore, has a value for all Muslims. But at the same time, is not necessarily the only correct interpretation of the ayah. So when they were speaking, they were not always narrating something. So we have this notion which comes later on of this division between tafsir bil ma'thur and tafsir bil ra'i. And I know that you were probably hinting towards this discussion, but I tried not to start with that because this creates a certain extreme dichotomy which then becomes confusing in later times. Everything that we call tafsir bil ma'thur, and that means narrated and transmitted exegesis, it has to have been transmitted from someone, and they have to have got it from somewhere, and sometimes where they got it from was their own mind, and they had every right to do so. But the early Muslims were very cautious about speaking from opinion, and we have these narrations about them expressing their discomfort with speaking from opinion. But what it was that they were avoiding is to say something based on pure desire. And later on we have someone like Imam Ghazali who clarifies that what is really meant by these hadiths which warn against speaking from ra'i or opinion is to impose your opinion on the Qur'an, or to speak without having the necessary knowledge and qualification to speak. Other than that, speaking from educated opinion, as I like to put it, this is what tafsir bil ra'i should be. Exegesis based on educated opinion, informed opinion. And for sure, Sahaba were engaging in that, and Tabi'een were engaging in that. That was not the era of tafsir bil ma'thur. What we now call tafsir bil ma'thur just means that we are picking up on things from those generations and their opinions and their statements, among which are some things which go back to the highest authority and reliable statement coming from the Prophet ﷺ. But a great deal is their educated opinion. So there isn't really a hard divide between this idea of tafsir bil ma'thur, tafsir bil ra'i, because ra'i, or using your mind and exercising opinion and judgment and analysis, has to be done by anyone who's called a mufassir, right? Yeah. If I'm purely going to be doing tafsir bil ma'thur, it just means I have to pick up a book and hand it to you and say, read that yourself, because it's ma'thur, I have nothing to do with it, right? A person who is going to be mufassir means that they have to sift through opinions and statements, and they have to decide which of them are strongest, and then they have to have usul, principles, as we said before. They have to have the hermeneutics that underpin what they're doing in order to reach those conclusions about which statements are the best, and then put those forward as the exegesis and the explanation of the Qur'an.
Yeah, and that is a process that is continual, and it will continue in perpetuity. So even in the modern day, it would be the same thing that's happening. Where is the source of kind of, I get that initial scholars, or early Sahaba, Tabi'un were, so followers of the companions, were more reluctant to do this. Was there a period which you would call where tafsir bil ra'i really took off, and there's a lot of content produced from that era? Do you think in the past maybe a couple of 100 years we've had a decline where we haven't had tafsir bil ra'i, or has it been more or less on and off?
Yeah. So there's one thing which would help to just sharpen what we've already said, and that is tafsir is in response to istifsar. Istifsar in Arabic means asking a question or asking for clarification, right? Istifsar is like questioning. Yeah. So every tafsir has behind it some kind of istifsar, right? Some question that arises either because somebody comes and asks the question, a believer, an unbeliever, and critic and challenger, or the mufassir himself or herself is reading the Quran, and a question comes to their mind which they think, oh, this needs a clarification, right? So when reading tafsir, I think it's very important for us to try to just think back to, why is this point being made? Why is it being said? What's the question that underpins that? And then we can go even a meta level above that and say, why was this question being asked, and who was asking this question, and why was this point not obvious? Why was it contentious at the time? But the reason I say that is because, as you pointed out, the need for tafsir will remain. But one of the reasons that need for tafsir remains is simply that new questions will continue to be asked. So in the beginning, there were certain types of questions which needed to be dealt with straight away. And then as society evolved and Islam spread in different cultures and places, new questions came up. Not just questions pertaining to, the fiqhi questions, the, juristic and practical questions, but questions around the meaning of the Quranic text as well. They would arise for different reasons. And one of them, as I alluded to, is sometimes that you're encountering people of other religions who come and challenge you about certain ayat and say, oh, your book says this. And that was, of course, happening during the time of revelation. And some ayat of the Qur'an have come in response to contentions that have been raised by the opponents of Islam and the critics of Islam. So as long as there is a growth in istifsar and questioning, there will need to be a growth in tafsir to answer those questions and to provide new answers to questions that may have been asked before. But sometimes the answer that was given becomes just a thing that is repeated over time. It becomes ma'thur in a way. So ma'thur, as we said, sometimes refers to, or generally refers to what you get from the first 3 generations of Muslims. But we can also say that tafsir ma'thur is just like where books come and just present the same opinions and same answers that were given in earlier books, instead of necessarily re-interrogating every question that was raised. And this is very natural. It's very natural to say, okay, if I'm writing about a particular ayah, I will say what's been said before. As long as I find it satisfactory, I would state the same. Even with the exact same words as was often done by Mufassirin, they would lift the words directly and put them in their own work. And that wouldn't necessarily be called plagiarism or seen as a bad thing. It would just be seen as, well, this is the heritage of the Muslims. We all own this. It's collective ownership of these words. And they wouldn't always see the need to attribute it in the way that we probably would maintain nowadays. But there you've got this ma'thur aspect of just repetition. And that's important when, if we come around to talk about consensus, because sometimes when we talk about the consensus of the Mufassirin, what we actually mean is just what is ma'thur, or what is mutawarath, what is inherited over time, where something is said over and over and over and over again, simply because nobody felt the need to reopen that case file, right? The case was closed, and until maybe the 20th century, where lots of new challenges have come up, and the 20th century, may Allah bless us in it, is going to continue to bring lots more challenges. So sometimes, we would argue that we need to reopen that case file, right? And that's not to break the consensus of the Mufassirin as if they all sat around and discussed every matter and agreed on every matter, but to a large extent, they were simply repeating what was said before. But, as come to the question that you raised, tafsir bil ra'i, how did it flower and how did it exist? So it depends if we want to include here simply reading the Quranic text and analyzing it linguistically. Is this tafsir bil ra'i? I wouldn't necessarily call it that, but insofar as it's not just, repeating statements. So it's not ma'thur. So in that sense, it's more like ra'i. That was happening very early on. And there are some books actually which are not so well known, I think, as they could be, but there were some books in the early stage of tafsir writing which are known as Ma'ani al-Qur'an, meanings of the Qur'an, but they were mostly focused on the linguistic aspect and the Quranic readings. And then those became an important source for someone like Imam al-Tabari. Imam al-Tabari's work is one of the seminal works in Islamic history, especially in a certain way that the history is told, right? So I'm going to push against that a little bit, but we'll start by saying Imam al-Tabari's work is one of the important tafsirs, and he gathers a lot of narrations. So that is why his work is typically seen as really a very ma'thur based work. But of course, if you look properly at al-Tabari's work, you would see, before mentioning those narrations, he says some stuff from himself. And after mentioning those narrations, he says some stuff about his conclusions. and he's exercising his ra'i, his ijtihad. He's bringing his scholarly brilliance to the fore, and his linguistic analysis and his contextual analysis. And again, the sort of caricature of early Mufassirin didn't know about context and coherence, and they weren't concerned with this. It is a caricature, because if you read them carefully, they were paying attention, in their own way at least, to issues of context and really trying to get to the deepest and most satisfying explanations. And I say explanations, by the way.
Is this caricature a kind of Oriental or Western invention, or?
It can be,
okay,
but it can also come from some within the modern era who've proposed new approaches. So Hamiduddin Farahi, for example, who's established this structural coherence school in the modern time. It's very subtle and very penetrating and interesting. But he sometimes, and others who write in his support, actually, so even Mustansir Mir and so on, and Mustansir Mir is drawing from Fazlur Rahman, who say that the earlier Mufassirin were all atomistic in their analysis, right? Sometimes when you want to advertise for your own project, you have to throw some shade on those who went before, in order to say what was the shortcoming of their work, in order to justify my work. That's very understandable, but we shouldn't then end up thinking that such subtleties and such value is not to be found in the earlier works. Farahi himself, a little bit surprisingly, is just in a footnote somewhere. He might have wanted to elaborate more, but he says basically At-Tabari's tafsir is all about narrations. Al-Razi's tafsir is all about philosophy. Ibn Kathir's tafsir is just a summary of At-Tabari. Zamakhshari's tafsir is just all about language. So that's in order to say, we need something else that really gathers these things and moves forward from them. But one thing, so a point that I was just going to pick up on the end there, when I say these Mufassirin, they were trying to get to the best meanings, and I said it definitely with an S, interpretations and meanings, because it was not necessarily the case for them that they were always trying to say this is the only meaning. They had a very open-minded approach to interpreting the Quran, whereby more than one thing could be valid and plausible. Indeed, more than one thing could hold true at the same time. Whereas, again, in modern times, and if I'm going to contrast again with Farahi was of the view that his method, which is about structural coherence, should lead to the single correct meaning, and that in any ayah there's only one intended meaning. And he really criticized the Mufassirin who went before, and he singled out Al-Razi for this. I said the likes of Al-Razi, who have made the Quran like a confused text, we need to turn and have a goodly opinion of the Quranic text, which in the past people have had a sort of negative opinion about, by which he means considering it very indeterminate or very open to a wide variety of interpretations. Because in a lot of these books, you do find a whole list of interpretations. And for many people, that's a negative, because they're saying, look, just tell me the answer. What's the answer? They don't want to go through the hard work of actually recognizing that there is openness and flexibility in the Quranic language, which does allow for multiplicity. And sure, you can come back after that. You should come back after that to whittle down those possibilities to what is perhaps the clearest one or the clearest few, which then, even then, that multiplicity might have a value. The different levels of meaning can have a value. So Tafsir bil-Ra'i, just in order to try to finish our thought about that, has always been there insofar as Mufassirin would come and they would advance different opinions from what was the established norm. They would have to be a little bit careful about that, because again, this varies according to what the subject is, what is the nature of the ayah. Going against consensus can be a very precarious thing, and can be a very wrong thing, depending on what the depending on a few factors, but one of those is what's the subject matter, right? If it's the kind of thing that the Muslims would have always had to have known about, so obviously the meaning of the word salah in the Qur'an, for example, if you're going to come and say, well, salah is actually something completely different, it's nothing to do with prayer, well, this would imply that Muslims have been fundamentally misguided since the early period, and that's not an acceptable assertion to make. But there are, for example, certain stories in the Qur'an where, or a parable or something like that, which perhaps someone can come along and say later, maybe we have mostly been reading this wrong, and maybe it should actually be read like this. And when you say that, a believer would still be saying, and I believe that the Prophet, peace be upon him, understood it this way, right? Even if we don't have a narration from him saying so, I believe that what I'm saying is consistent with the Prophet ﷺ and the most knowledgeable among his companions having known that. But it's also possible that some of the companions didn't understand it in the right way. That's not a sacrilegious statement. And wherever this happens, this is, again, is going to be labeled by some people as tafsir bil ra'i. But even those who, in a way, created this dichotomy for us, right? So most importantly, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he has said some words which have ended up being ended up turning into what we call tafsir bil ma'thur, tafsir bil ra'i. So he praised at-Tabari's tafsir, for example, and said, it is among the best tafasir ma'thura, right? So what exactly did he mean by that? But he seemed to be implying that its value is its narrations. In fact, he even went on to say that it would have been even better if he just stuck to the narrations instead of all the other stuff. But if we look at Ibn Taymiyyah's own writings and contributions in tafsir, I have a research paper coming out soon about something very original that he wrote. You can see that he was exercising his scholarly genius and brilliance and originality and creativity as much as anyone else, as much as the people that he criticized very strongly, because that's only natural to do, right? If you see that people have perhaps been misreading, the ayah that I'm actually looking at is one of about rulings. It is the ayah of Qisas in Surah Al-Baqarah. Ibn Taymiyyah came with a very different opinion, but for him it was not tafsir bil ra'i, because he found there were some amongst the tabi'een who expressed that view, right? So because he was able to find a precedent, it was not completely, he didn't bring it out of thin air. However, his view is extremely different from the Jumhur of the Mufassirin. It completely goes against the consensus around this ayah. And in fact, nobody after him has followed him in it either, which is one of the stranger things that I draw attention to in my paper.
I think so we've talked a little bit tangentially, and it's been kind of trying to bring that together. We talked a little bit about the earliest sources of tafsir as we think about it, which is kind of more the compilation. So not just the compilation, not just, yes, the sources are the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, the companions, and the Tabi'un, the followers of the companions. But what are some of the earliest compilations and what we would call the earliest sources of tafsir? So you mentioned Tabari, you mentioned a few other books. Are they the earliest? Are there earlier texts that they're drawing from? And then are their opinions and their compilation and their epistemology, is it more valid than later ones? Because we tend to have this norm where classical texts or classical texts in quotation marks are referred to as the kind of the benchmark, or they're almost used as an appeal to authority. And do you think that's valid? Do you think earlier tafsir, earlier sources, just by virtue of them being earlier, had better value? Is it something different about the way those scholars did it?
Right. So I think that we have certain compilations which are earlier than At-Tabari, in terms of collections of narrations. The tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim is an example, slightly earlier, but considerably earlier than both of them. We have some extant tafsir works. The tafsir of Muqatil ibn Sulaiman is
what's extant? Sorry, mean?
Like we still have it. It's not been lost. Yeah, so still existent in a way. So Tafsir of Muqatil ibn Sulaiman is so far the earliest sort of full tafsir in a sense, right? That's not just narrations gathered in something else. Very recently, we've got a work. I have a copy of it here because I was just studying something. This is called Mawsu'at at-Tafsir al-Ma'thur. Right, I'm not going to do a full book showcase, but this is let me see how many volumes. 24 volumes, recent publication, which brings together the materials from these several works, including the Tafsir of al-Tabari and Muqatil and Ibn Abi Hatim and others, and brings them together into one place where you can actually look at those narrations together. So that's a very useful thing for researching early opinions. But in terms of how the books were structured and put together, naturally there's a kind of evolution on how authorship is done and how things are going to be addressed and framed and presented. So we have these books which pretty much present the narrations, and later on the Mufassirin are going to have to engage with those narrations and critique them, select between them, weigh them up, interpret what the interpreter was saying, because that's another level of hermeneutics, if you like, where somebody is going to make an exegetical statement, an explanatory sentence, and then there's something ambiguous about that statement as well, which then requires some further probing. What did that person actually mean by their statement? So we should expect that there's an evolution of the authorship needs and the readership needs, right? So that comes full circle in a way. Like things started to expand more and more. So more and more is being written. At-Tabari himself, his tafsir is extremely voluminous, but the historical reports tell us that he actually intended to write one that was, I don't know exactly, but like 10 times as large. But then he just said, people will not be able to read it. He said to his students, you wouldn't be able to read it, you wouldn't study it properly. So I'm making this condensed kind of version, even though now it looks very big to us. So the possibilities are endless. I mean, if we believe that about the Qur'an, that its meanings are limitless, then we should not think that the explanation has to be extremely limited. So there's a general tendency of growth over time. But then there is also this concomitant need among some people to have things which are easier to access and easier to appreciate. So then you have mukhtasars, or condensed tafsirs, which are summarized from earlier works. And then in the modern times, you've got more and more tafsir muyassar and mukhtasar, and just like summarized, made easy. Your question was about sort of how do we compare, how authoritative do we consider things that are later compared to things that are earlier? A lot goes back to the authority of the mufassir, that person that we are reading. How did they engage with the materials? So again, when it comes to these kind of caricatures, one of the caricatures about Tafsir al-Razi, people think that he's not actually dealing with narrations, for example, but he is. I know that because I translate his work, so I have to deal with the narrations when they come up. He's certainly reading the narrations, and one of his sources that he's looking at is the Tafsir of al-Tabari, and also the Tafsir of al-Wahidi, and he pays a lot of attention to the Tafsir of Zamakhshari, and he pays attention to some of the other Mu'tazila as well. So he's reading these things, he's processing what he's reading, and then he's giving his conclusions based on that. So when he's finding things that were said by some of the Salaf, that is weighing into his conclusions. Now, the fact that he's not listing all what the Salaf said doesn't mean that his conclusions are lacking that information, or that he has bypassed the opinions of the Salaf. What he's tried to do in a way is just move us a stage beyond reading those narrations, partly because you have At-Tabari's tafsir, you have Ibn Abi Hatim's or whoever's, and now you've got Mawsu'at at-Tafsir al-Ma'thur, where you can read all those things if you just want to look at the raw material. But if you want the brilliance of a mufassir, you want to get to the point without having to read through everything that was said by everyone including statements that are sometimes a bit difficult to understand, or statements that have not been very authentically narrated from those people. So you have to sift between, the sahih isnads versus the da'if and the mawdu' or whatever. So that's what they were attempting to do. And it remains open enough for people who are expert enough in our time, if they should emerge, to analyze those things again, analyze those materials, and have different assessments.
Talking about different assessments and kind of new assessments, there's a couple of points that come up, which is most mufassirun for the bulk of Islamic history on some issues might be united. So for example, maybe there seems to be a consensus on the superiority of men over women. Does their consensus provide their opinion religious validity? And then how do we look at modern mufassirun who have challenged that view? Is it a case of them reacting to their surroundings and assimilating too much and leaving the core of the tradition, or is it a case of actually there was always enough leg room, so to speak, in the kind of the Ma'thur history?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex question, because we touched a bit before on this idea of open and closed cases, as I put it. So when something has been taken as a good enough statement around the ayah, then the case file is closed and people are content to just repeat what was said. But there might come a cause to reopen that case file. Perhaps a clearer example of that is if some new knowledge emerges, like through the process of science. So Mufassirin would generally explain things based on the understanding of their time, and that includes what we can call the science of their time. Again, Ar-Razi is quite open about doing this, where he'll say, like, for example, that doesn't mean that every statement is, by the way, wrong. Sometimes the science of their time was advanced enough to dismiss certain faulty readings. So when he comes to the ayah in Surah Al-Kahf about the sun seeming to set in a murky pool, so he talks about some people who, out of their ignorance, took that literally and thought that this means that the sun is going around the earth. So and that it actually sets in a murky pool. But then he says, look, we looking at the science, we have to, he doesn't use the word science, but he says if you were to observe the movements of the sun, and for example, you would see that a solar eclipse, when a solar eclipse is recorded I've got a map here, so in these different countries, we find that some of it is happening in the morning, some of it's happening in the evening, and from that we can conclude certain things about the earth and the relationship between the earth and the sun. So he was, in a way, dismissing certain superficial readings of the Quran based on the science of his time, and he was, as we would hopefully all agree, was right to do so at that time. But what that points to is the fact that, well, later on there can be things that he took for granted, which later science tells us, well, actually, that is not correct. So let's look again at the ayah. Does the ayah necessarily mean this superficial thing, which then would be incorrect scientifically? Or can we read it in another way that accords with our current understanding? So this is sometimes, people get very uncomfortable about that and say it's tafsir ilmi, it's scientific tafsir. But the problem is sometimes a lot of other things happen, like the so-called scientific miracles kind of approach, which people mix up with this subject. The basic idea of reading things according to your current knowledge is valid and correct. But when you do that, you have the humility to know that this is open to being fixed later on, right? So I will bring what I can. And that is all that God would task me to do. He cannot task me to have all knowledge of all things for all times, but only to act according to the best knowledge that we have reached in our current time, while knowing that any statement that we make is subject to being overturned, unlike the statements of God himself in the Quran. So That's with regards to science, right? So you've raised a question around, let's say, an issue of understanding equality, relationship between the sexes, for example, and that is something which, you know, people would raise the question about it or reopen the case file due to a shift in understanding, not as such based on science, although that could be part of it, but a change of attitudes, right? And even a change of ideologies, right? So even then, I mean, that might not be as pressing a reason to open the case file as opposed to like something flat out contradicting the science of the age. But it could be enough reason to say, look, are we so sure that the Quran takes this particular stance that everybody now finds is problematic and they feel is outdated and they feel is unjust? Does the Quran definitely say these particular things? Let's look again. Let's ask the question again. Let's reopen the case file. When reopening the case file, let's look at what has been said and how it's been read. But let's ask the question also, what was the question being answered at that time? Why was that question being asked? Why was this answer given? Do we know that we have a complete survey of the way that people understood this ayah in the early times, right? Or again, as I pointed out before, is it a case of certain things trickle down and make it into the books and other things are overlooked or suppressed, right? Because there's this whole story about how tafsir reaches us, which means we have to be aware that, you know, we are just grasping at the things that happen, you know, survivor bias of tafsir, right? So certain things reach us and other things just disappear. Where are the opinions of women sort of in the whole of our history? You know, we do have Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, her statements are found in tafsir, but apart from that, you don't find much. Were there not at least a few more female mufassirat? You know, that's a question that still needs to be really investigated properly. But if there were women making very important statements in tafsir, for some reason we're just not finding them in our books today. So what was their take on such ayat which seem to express superiority of men over women, for example? So what we can say is, you know, the question would be here, are those statements being in a way derived from the Quranic ayat, sort of cleanly, purely, innocently, rigorously, in a scholarly manner, based on the Quran, people concluded, for example, men are superior to women? Is that where it came from? Or are there also prior assumptions, cultural norms, which then affect how the Quran is read? I'm not going to say it is necessarily one or the other, because there has to be some interplay between these things. Your cultural setting, as well as your scientific setting, historical setting, the events which are happening in the world, affect how you're going to react to the text. And this is something which is, you know, in Western hermeneutics is well accounted for or definitely recognized. I think in our Islamic hermeneutics, we've still, you know, to maybe grapple with this problem of subjectivity. I may be wrong in saying this, but it's just my impression that I think that the subjectivity problem in Islamic hermeneutics still needs to be properly investigated. And when we tend to try to raise it, it comes across as some kind of Western Western thought that we're imposing. But all that I'm saying here is you've got to try to account for what went into this interpretation. There are certain statements in the Quran which, you know, can be plainly understood as a superiority of one or the other. I don't want to raise them because then I would have to go into their explanation and the history of their explanation and what's my view about them. But to try to stick to your sort of in principle question, these can be looked at again in terms of, okay, what are the words here in the divine statement? What is the passage context, the revelatory context? To what extent is what's being stated here specific to the context that is being discussed? Even if some people read it as a general rule, right? Maybe it's not a general rule. Maybe it's more specific. If you find sometimes in the Quran that such a thing is actually being quoted by someone who has said it, like Potiphar, the Aziz in Surah Yusuf, he says some things, right? And some people take his words that, yeah, Potiphar is very wise. Inna kayda kunna azim, right? So, so he makes a certain statement about women in general. Are we supposed to take that as divinely endorsed statement because God didn't come after and say Potiphar was wrong in what he said? He didn't cancel it, so it must be right. Yeah, a bit simplistic for me, because I think we're supposed to ponder on the reasons why certain characters in the Quran are being quoted as saying certain things. Why were they saying that? You read the whole situation, the surroundings. So yeah, it's a question of the case file being opened again. But when it's opened again, I want to see that we take proper account of everything that was said and expressed before. But we also try to go around that and beyond that. We give everything its due respect, but we also appreciate the epistemic value of every statement. So to what extent is this statement, definite, authoritative, definitive, can't be overturned? To what extent was it clearly someone's opinion, and someone's opinion can be taken or left?
So you said something very interesting there. You said tafsir bias and compilation bias, where some things were kept and others weren't. Was this purely something that happened in every field? How does the compilation of tafsir and the way things were documented and kept and which narrations were chosen or not, how does that differ from what happened in the hadith, in the preservation of hadith, for example, or the preservation of Seerah, or the preservation of the Qira'at, Fiqh, etc.?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know. I can probably mount a very detailed answer to that, but it's one that's worth looking at. I just noticed, for example, just to start with tafsir, to elaborate a little bit, like I mentioned to you about this view that Ibn Taymiyyah advocated around qisas. I don't want to go into what that view is. You can read my paper later on. But what's interesting is that before Ibn Taymiyyah, we can find it in the sort of fragmented form in At-Tabari. Already in At-Tabari himself is kind of dismissing it and saying, oh, those people who said such and such, who claimed such and such, he's already saying that it's not a good view. And then there's very few works that even mention it at all. And even from those same people that it's being narrated from, like Ash-Sha'bi, As-Suddi, so a few people that's being narrated from, you can find sort of contrary narrations from the same people. So it becomes confusing as to see, what did Ash-Sha'bi and As-Suddi actually believe? Ibn Taymiyyah comes and gives this view clarity and argues for it. And then after him, nobody mentions that view again, right? It just basically doesn't come up in tafsir again. It's like he killed it. That's not actually what happened, but it's more complex, a question of like, why did Ibn Taymiyyah's tafsir not catch on? But what's interesting, even Ibn Kathir, who is famous for being a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, does not even mention that opinion, presumably because he was unaware of his sheikh's treatise where he had written it, maybe in jail. And it didn't emerge until the 20th century when these things have been sort of compiled into. It's now in Majmu' al-Fatawa. So that's not necessarily because people were trying to suppress it. It's because it just wasn't seen as a very good or convincing opinion. But if you read Ibn Taymiyyah, you suddenly, that's quite profound. That's not bad at all. There might be some points of critique that can be leveled against it. But there are various views that people just didn't like. There would be issues with regards to competition between theological schools, which statements, a certain ayah is seen, at least in one interpretation, to support, that our opponents. So we're definitely not going to mention their arguments for it.
And how reliable is it that this, like, for example, this treatise was, if it was only discovered in the 20th century, how reliable is it that it was absolutely written by Ibn Taymiyyah? Because hadith is very rigorous, and asnad and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, so that I think that there's not, I don't think it's really disputed that these things are Ibn Taymiyyah's. that would create a complication for my paper if it isn't. But I think these things have been gathered from certain libraries where it is understood that Ibn Taymiyyah's writings have been kept safe.
Okay.
And it kind of fits in. It's not that controversial that it is his opinion, and certainly it carries his signature sort of style of argumentation, and the fact that he relied on some narrations from the Salaf to make his point as well. But this idea of selection bias is, it's, when I say bias, I don't mean necessarily people out there with an agenda. It's just what they deem worthy of mentioning, and other things are not deemed worthy of mentioning. But later on we might wish had been captured, not been lost. And I think in all these fields that you mentioned, there'll be certain types of survivor bias, but it's not necessarily problematic so much. It's just that there was a process of sifting. There was a process of things which are better have mostly been kept. Things which were considered to be of lower quality were allowed to sort of filter out and to fizzle away into oblivion.
Okay, so that's very interesting, and that's very interesting points on the development. I think one question from a layman's perspective is, when trying to analyze or trying to choose a tafsir book, especially modern tafsirs, there's a fear of which one to choose. And of course, I think you mentioned as well that some of the books, such as that are relied on. So, for example, in linguistic tafsir, the authority is often considered to be Zamakhshari, and then there's a lot of other tafsir that are written by other Mu'tazilis, who of course have differing views. And so a lot of people talk about Zamakhshari's tafsir as being dangerous because he mentioned some of his Mu'tazili views in there, which someone reading without proper understanding, or at least knowing what this is, might think this is an orthodox view. So how do you kind of tackle that problem as someone trying to breach the world of tafsir?
Well, I think it depends, how much time you want to invest and how much you want to try to specialize. Insofar as somebody wants, to approach the Qur'an and get a basic idea of its meanings, you should pick to start with the simplest thing, the quickest thing to read. And people overlook, to be honest, the value of Qur'an translations in this department, which, as I said right at the beginning, should be considered a part of tafsir literature. It's a certain type of tafsir. A lot of it is written by people who are not actually that qualified. So maybe we can ignore those type, but let's take the ones that are some of the best, quality ones. I don't want to go too much into naming names, but those which we are fairly confident that the person writing the translation is a scholar and is working with the tafsir literature, right, in order to write their translation and footnotes. It's quite important to have some notes that surround the text. But this is actually a very nice form of tafsir. We should all have read at least one, translation with footnotes before talking about, like, I'm going to go into tafsir of Zamakhshari or tafsir of Ibn Ashur or whatever it might be, because especially as people who are not native Arabic speakers, but even, dare I say, native Arabic speakers, they're really missing out if they don't read translations. If you have the ability to read a translation, I think you should read a translation of the Quran, because it's a different style of tafsir, which is actually very effective at ingraining meanings. Because I know native Arabic speakers who sometimes hear ayat of the Quran and they don't understand some of the words, and they find it hard to admit to themselves, so they don't understand the words. Even worse, they might actually completely misunderstand what the word is, but they thought that they understood it. And I will not tell you some hilarious examples that I've encountered in my life of this. So what I would say is start with what is simple and what is most accessible. And beyond that, so modern works have a certain advantage of distilling the opinions over the past centuries. And they also have the advantage of being written in a, generally a more accessible style, even in Arabic. And they also have the advantage of trying to contextualize things roughly to where we are now, right? If not the 21st century, then maybe the 20th. So they might already have filtered certain things that would be hard to process from earlier centuries. When you are going to go into the source text, and it was good that you raised the fact that Zamakhshari's tafsir is very important. It's not something that I highlighted yet. And because as I said, there's a certain story of tafsir that's told by some groups of like the most important tafsir is like At-Tabari and then Ibn Kathir and then a few more Salafi ones in the 20th century, right? In our overall history of tafsir, that is really not the case. Yeah. I acknowledge the importance of At-Tabari. Ibn Kathir, not so much. Ibn Kathir hasn't been a very pivotal work. It's actually a very good work. It's a very valuable work, but it's not been historically a very important work, significant. And one of the ways of assessing that is to say who was teaching these works, which seminaries were teaching tafsir and what were they using. So if we look, for example, at the Ottoman inventory of texts that they were teaching, it all revolves around Az-Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi and also Tafsir al-Razi, and then some later works from the Ottoman tafsirs. But with Zamakhshari and Baydawi, there are lots of hashiyas or super commentaries written. So like I said, sometimes a statement made by a mufassir, needs further explanation. So that's where the hashia comes in. There's extra points made around what the mufassir has said, as well as trying to contextualize and understand where the mufassir was coming from on certain of their points, and also sometimes disagreeing with them and arguing with them in the footnotes. We have this incredible tradition, really full of debate and full of variety, full of analysis, and I really feel that a lot of the way that we talk about our tradition does disservice to this. And even the hashia tradition, sometimes people see it as a sign of stagnation and decline. All we did was write hashiyas upon hashiyas and sharh upon sharh. Yeah, but there's actually a positive aspect of that. Sure, maybe the originality of new types of authorship was something desirable, and came back to us in the modern era. But this period of time when we're putting hashiyas upon hashiyas is actually got a level of depth, and it's very interesting to tap into what they're saying and how they're debating points. And just to conclude this point, I mean, one of the works that really gathers that sort of range of debate, for me, the masterwork of tafsir is the tafsir of Al-Alusi, who died in 1854. Al-Alusi just gathers this tradition which has flowered, especially in the Ottoman period, and you find all that debate really in a very terse way, gathered on his pages with presentation and analysis. And in terms of your question of how to deal with these, like say if you were reading Mu'tazili tafsir and how to, in a sense, filter, well, what you can do is you can jump straight to the school of your choosing. So if you want an Ash'ari presentation or Ahl Sunnah presentation more broadly, so Al-Baydawi and Al-Razi have both taken the materials in Zamakhshari and recast them, and you're not left with the Mu'tazili flavor anymore. There's plenty of hashiyas and commentaries on Zamakhshari's tafsir, which also do this kind of pointing out of the Mu'tazili issues. But that's quite tough, so really, in order to navigate that kind of thing, you need to have actually studied some theology. You need to know what the issues are, and where, if you are from Ahl Sunnah or whatever your particular leanings are, where my own school stands on a particular issue, in order to recognize where that person is departing from it. Because tafsir, and this is an important point that we should highlight, is, as some have called it, a catch-all genre. It is one in which you can find in these detailed works, all kind of things are represented, all the different ulum, sciences, disciplines, in Islamic thought, and even, as broadly conceived as possible, can be found in tafsir, partly because a lot of these authors, what they did, they were working in theology, in fiqh, philosophy, whatever it may be, and then sort of at the later part of their life, in the last few years of their life, is when they compile their tafsir and they gather sort of everything and all the benefits that they've gathered through the years of study and debate, and they put them here in the pages of their tafsir. So the Quranic ayah becomes a locus for, as we say, not just the tafsir, but everything besides, right? I'm thinking about tafsir of al-Razi as a very clear example of that.
Okay, I think that leads me on to that next question, which is actually, let's simplify this further. And what would you say for someone who's starting off? There's a lot of options out there. So even in translation, you've got M.A.S. Abdul Halim, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, and kind of, myriad of others, Marmaduke Pickthall. In terms of tafsir, you've got Tafsir al-Jalalain, you've got al-Razi, which is now available in English thanks to your efforts. Jazakumullah khair. You've got Tafhim al-Qur'an by Maududi. You've got Ibn Kathir is very widely available. You've shattered that in my head. I always had the impression that it was the classical work that everybody used, but actually there's no evidence for that. And there's the one by Saeed Qutb fi Dhilal al-Qur'an. So how do you go about choosing, and which one do you specifically recommend as a, because you said pick up the simplest book available. Well, which one's the simplest book?
So as I said, in terms of Quran translations, and you've listed some of them, and these are a good list already. Add Muhammad Asad to that list. Muhammad Asad, of course, again, people would feel the need to sort of navigate between things that he said, like similar to what we said about Zamakhshari, because Muhammad Asad has certain rationalist, modernist tendencies, which not everybody wants to follow him in. But what I really appreciate about Muhammad Asad is that he's very transparent in his footnotes about why he's saying what he says and where he gets it from. And that's something which I think we need to follow that thought process and see, even if he makes some errors, and I found some places where he misunderstood al-Razi, in my view, in order to reach the conclusion that he reached. But these are important works to get into. And then, as you pointed out, there are some tafsirs that are being translated. Honestly speaking, even though I work in translating tafsir, it's not an ideal situation. What we really need is for tafsir to be written in different languages and to be written in English. And
is there anything written in English at the moment that's purely written in English that's not a translation?
These translations are so translation, and then sort of a more extended version of the same kind of thing. You've got the Study Qur'an now, which is like that same kind of style. Again, it's got those things you've got to, if you're not a perennialist, you're going to have to avoid whatever they talk about validity of multiple religions. But again, there's going to be a great deal of detail in there beyond what you get in typical translations. But there are some translations that preceded that also have very detailed footnotes. I just recently got hold of the fuller translation done by Abdul Majid Daryabadi. So some of the Indian scholars, and you mentioned Maududi. I think you mentioned Said Qutb actually. Maududi has Tafhim al-Quran as well, which again, you have the more detailed versions of these. But that was in Urdu rather than English. Yeah. So there are things, but I think there's definitely room for more and better things. But in terms of translations, we have a compound of problems here. Some of the works that were translated were not suitable for translation. Tafsir al-Jalalain is not suitable for translation, and yet it's been translated twice. So it's also not suitable to read in translation. I don't know what benefit. I mean, maybe someone will disagree with me who's listening, but I just cannot see what benefit you'd get from reading a translation of Jalalain, because it was not written in a way that lends itself to translation. Secondly, the qualifications of the translators. It's very important for anyone translating our ulum in general that the translator be properly trained in that specific ilm that they're translating, as well as their competency in the Arabic language and the English language and the process of translation. With these things being absent, it is very possible that someone does more harm than good, or as much harm as good, because they're just going to simply misunderstand things that they're reading and they're going to render them wrong. And if I were to go into examples of this in the existing translations, we would get into a very depressing place. Suffice to say that I am currently editing a translation of Tafsir of Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi. So it's a bit more expansive than the Jalalain. It's more suitable for translation than Jalalain is. I still might not have myself picked it for the purpose, but it's been done, and now I'm working on just making sure that the translation is accurate. So when it's published, that will be one that I could happily recommend because I know what went into it, and I'm fairly confident that it will be well representing what Ibn Juzay was saying. Right. Some of the other translations are good. Some of them are pretty bad, to be frank. We should know that Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, for example, again, I'm not discouraging anyone from going and reading it. Just be aware that, first of all, that it's an abridged version of his Tafsir. It's not everything that Ibn Kathir said. Every translation is abridged, as far as I'm aware. The translations from Al-Qurtubi are also a little bit abridged. There's a partial translation from At-Tabari. There's a couple of partial translations from At-Tabari. There are translations from certain Urdu tafsirs, like Ma'arif al-Qur'an, I think you might have mentioned. So these things are useful. Make use of them, read them. That's what we've got. I don't discourage anyone from using them. There's little bits from, Hasan Islahi's tafsir as well, Tadabbur al-Quran, pondering over the Quran. But dribs and drabs so far. Inshallah, over time, I'm intending to really add to this library. So Tafsir of Al-Razi, as you mentioned, we have so far volume 1, but it's not an easy read because volume 1 is where he really sets out his philosophical stall, and so part of the book is very much tafsir-like, but a lot of it is philosophical, theological, and it's quite hard work to read. I did my best to help you in the footnotes, but the next volume, inshallah, will be much more accessible and easier to understand because it's following some surahs that you'll find it easier to understand what's being said. Surah Yusuf, Surah Al-Kahf, Surah Al-Naml, Surah Al-Mulk, maybe Surah Yasin. So there's going to be something which is easier to follow. And, one doesn't want to blow one's own trumpet, but at least, I would vouch for my own work just because I'm me. Other people can, of course, criticize and critique.
Oh, but appreciate that. I think there's just from this call, we've had a lot of things of yours to follow. We've got the research paper, translation of Razi, edited translation of Al-Juzay. So Jazakallah khair for all the work that you're putting in.
And I would say, by the way, my thesis also is available open access. So if you just type in Sohaib Saeed and intra-Qur'anic Hermeneutics, if you can figure out how to spell it, you can put it in the description or a link maybe. That thesis is available to read, and I'm turning it into a book called Explaining the Qur'an Through the Qur'an, which will be out in a couple of years.
And I think there's a link on your Twitter as well. So on Twitter, Sheikh Sohaib Saeed goes as @tafsirdoctor. You can also follow us on Twitter at Islam Ages, and send through further questions because we would love to have Sheikh Sohaib on again to discuss some of these aspects in detail. I already talked to you about, perhaps we could talk about Al-Razi and the historical context that he lived in and try and get a little bit more of a flavor for that from that perspective. But really appreciate your time. It's been really, really interesting. Lots of resources come out from it, but also really sets the scene for how Quranic exegesis developed over the course of history, and lots of practical, hopefully, tips for people to take away. With that, we'll sign off. Any feedback, comments, etc., you can email us at islamthroughtheages@gmail.com, and we will tie up with another episode in this introductory series that we're doing. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.